While Jesus is a master storyteller in all of the Gospels, that's particularly true in the Gospel of Luke. Some of the material that we would think of as being in our L source from our Synoptic Gospels chart, if you remember that, things that are just unique to the Gospel of Luke are some of the most beloved and well-known stories or parables attributed to Jesus. Stories like we would think of like the rich man and Lazarus or the Good Samaritan. Those things only occur in the Gospel of Luke, and they occur as parts of highlighting his teaching, ways of incarnating a concept. So he'll teach for a while and then he'll tell a parable. For example, and Luke also does a lot of controversy narratives where somebody comes to Jesus asking a question, usually with the intention of making him look bad or trying to dig at him a little bit. Jesus responds to their question with a question. They get the answer right. Jesus affirms their rightness and turns their correct answer into a moral challenge. That happens a few times in the Gospel of Luke. And one of the first times that we find that is in Luke chapter 10. One day, an expert in religious law or a scribal teacher, somebody who had spent their life in the study of the Old Testament, decides to test Jesus by asking him this question: "Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" So what kind of good deeds, what kind of goodness of life or keeping of the commands is enough to merit eternal life? So to ensure I'm going to heaven. Jesus answers with a question. He replies and says, "What does the law of Moses say? How do you read it?" And this man responds with two quotes from the Old Testament. He says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength," which is the Shema. That's essentially the Jewish declaration of faith. That's what life is about. And then he said, "You must love your neighbor as yourself." If you notice, that's an important set of concepts. Jesus responds and he says, "That's right. If you do that, you'll live." But the man wished to justify himself. So perhaps he felt challenged by the way Jesus responded, as if Jesus saying that, if you had been doing this, you wouldn't have to worry about it. He says, well, who is my neighbor? Now, even in the Ten Commandments, that structure of love God and love people is pretty fundamental to the life of the people of Israel. The first four of the Ten Commandments are all about how you love God. Don't have any other gods before me. Don't build idols. Don't take my name in vain. Remember my Sabbath and keep it holy. And the last six are about loving people. Honor your father and mother. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't bear false witness. So you can see how this works together. This is a huge concept in their thinking. This man says, okay, well, surely you can't mean that as a universal. And he's looking for a way to limit love of neighbor. Is this just to my fellow Jew? Is it just to my fellow Pharisee? Is it just to people who deserve it? And Jesus responds with a story. So Jesus has affirmed that this man knows the right answer, that the right answer is there in the Old Testament. That's a huge theme in Luke. Luke does not knock the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures at all. He understands them a little differently and demonstrates slightly less familiarity with them than does Matthew. But Luke affirms that there's a lot in there that's life-giving. And Jesus here says, see, the answer was there. You knew it. And the man tries to say, well, how do you apply it? The question is about interpretation and hermeneutics. How do you apply this stuff to real life? And Jesus tells him this story. He says, there was a Jewish man traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And just so that you can understand what that looks like, Jerusalem is 2,300 feet above sea level. It's on the slopes of a rather low mountain. Jericho, which is slightly less than 20 miles away, is 1,300 feet below sea level. So you're talking about a 2,600 foot drop in less than 20 miles. This is a huge difference in elevation, and it was a very dangerous road. During that time, and you can see a picture of the road here, this particular road was known to be extremely dangerous. It was a hunting ground for bandits and thieves. And Jesus says, there's a man that's traveling down this road. He says, there's a Jewish man traveling down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. He got attacked by bandits, and they stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead lying beside the road. So they took everything he had, even his underpants, and left him there to bleed to death. By chance, a priest came along, and when he saw the man lying there, he crossed over to the other side of the road and passed by. So you would think that somebody who's God's official representative to the people and somebody who leads these acts of religious worship would certainly help, but he crosses by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, a Levite. somebody who's kind of like, if you think of like the preacher and the deacon. The Levite would have been a pillar in the community, somebody who helped point people to the right way to live. And he comes close to the man, he looks at him, but he also passes by. And then a third stranger comes. Now, stories like this were pretty common, just to interrupt Jesus' story a little bit, were pretty common at that time. Temple clergy were kind of seen as corrupt, and people were frustrated with the temple apparatus. When Jesus, you're familiar with the story by now since we've looked at it in 2 Gospels, does what's called the cleansing of the temple, when he turns over the tables and he lets the sacrificial animals loose. That met with popular acclaim. People thought that was cool, because it's like, it's about time somebody did this, because there was some feeling of frustration and corruption with the temple apparatus and the clergy themselves. What people would have expected to have come along was just an average, ordinary Joe the Jew that would have helped them. Instead, Jesus inserts a surprising character. Now today, when we say Good Samaritan or Samaritan, that has an entirely positive connotation, and it's because of this story. At the time of Jesus and to his original audience, at the Sittim Leben, their setting in life of this story, that would not have been the case. The Samaritans and the Jews openly hated each other, and they had for centuries. Around 538 BC, when the Jews began to resettle their land after the Babylonian exile, Ezra the priest said that some of the people who had been left behind, who had intermarried with locals, could no longer be part of the covenant community of God's Israel. And these were people that were so excited to see their kinsmen coming back, and they wanted to work with them to build the temple. And Ezra said, unfortunately, you're not ethnically pure. You're kicked out. And he presented some of them with the choice of they could divorce their foreign wives and get rid of their children, or they could leave altogether with them and be expelled with them from the covenant community, and many did. And that's where the Samaritans came from. So you can imagine that getting started like that wouldn't exactly make you like the people who treated you that way in such an exclusionary way. And things only got worse after the centuries passed between the two groups. The Samaritans set up a rival religion and a rival temple on Mount Gerizim, claiming that the Jews had perverted the actual teachings of Moses, but they had the correct ones. So they had their own version of the Torah, they had their own temple apparatus, they had their own religion, and hatred between the two groups grew and grew. There was wars between the groups. In 183 BC, John Hyrcanus, who was a Jewish king, led his troops over in a surprise attack and completely destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim, which further solidified the hatred between the groups. There were rabbinic teachers running around at the time of Jesus. I want to say Rabbi Akiba was one who said, if you see a Samaritan pregnant woman in distress, don't give her any aid, because you're just bringing an enemy of God into the world if she gives birth. Don't trouble yourself to save the life of a Samaritan. They're just fit for the fires of hell. You can find some pretty hateful things written about one group by the other. Jews would typically travel far the way around Samaria, so they didn't even have to get the dust of that land on their feet, even if it inconvenienced their journey. And the Samaritans didn't much like them either. Jesus is a huge exception in his treatment of these folks. And his decision here to say a Samaritan, when he would have said that, the original audience would have shuddered and said, man, the guy has no hope now. If anybody was going to just finish this guy off, it's him. But this Samaritan, this person who's from a suspect religious group, who's from a deviant people group in the minds of the original hearers of this parable, is the person who stops, who helps, who applies ancient first aid, who puts this man on his donkey and carries him to an inn and pays good money up front to have this man cared for. Jesus asks the question, which of these men was a neighbor to the one who was hurt? And the lawyer, unable to say the Samaritan, says the one who showed mercy. And Jesus turns that into a challenge to go and do the same. Now, this text is pretty challenging for anybody who hears it, because we all have good reasons as we look around to not stop and help. We have things to do, we have places to go, we have things that we're busy with, responsibilities. And for the priest and the Levite in particular, if this man had died while they were in contact with him, they would have been invalidated for performing their religious service to the community and would have had to go through a protracted period of time of isolation and ritual cleansing. And that was more important to them than helping this human being in need. In Luke's gospel, as in all portrayals of Jesus, human need is more important than ceremonial law, even if it involves the violation of ceremonial law, like David eating the bread of the presence, and he invokes that several times as he goes through the gospel. What we have here is really an ongoing theme of social justice. This parable has a context within the gospel, and it's within Luke's treatise on discipleship, what it means to be somebody who's following Jesus. Jesus has said it means taking up your cross every day and following me. And here he converts it into, as we come across people in everyday life who need help, to offer that help, regardless of whatever reasons or justifications, however valid, we have to not do so. Jesus says what God is looking for is neighborliness, that we would demonstrate that, come to the aid of another in need. What's interesting, though, is the very next story, which is a story of Mary and Martha, where Jesus goes to the home of this family that he really loves, and it's just sort of a retreat place for him. And Martha is making this big fuss about everything. And this is just the next verse over. She wants to make this big meal, but Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. That's an unusual phrase for a woman to be doing to a rabbi, because it means she's in the posture of a learner. She's one of his disciples, is engaged in being taught and participating in the religious discussion, which most Jewish teachers at that time wouldn't have allowed. Jesus is kind of pro-women and pro-women's lib in a way that was unheard of before him by most Jewish religious teachers. Martha is annoyed by this, though, and she says, I'd like to hear too, Jesus. Doesn't it bother you that Mary just sits around listening to you without getting up to help me, and I'm doing all the serving? Jesus responds, Martha, Martha, you're troubled and bothered about many things. Mary has chosen the better part, and it won't be taken for her. We're kind of like, well, what's the deal with that? The reason these two stories live together within this treatise on discipleship is they create a picture of a balanced life, that somebody best loves and serves their neighbor when they love and are connected to God and are engaged in his teaching and are spending time in his presence, feasting on the presence of his word, instead of distracted by a lot of good things. And that's true for many aspects of life. We can get distracted by good things and miss the best things, which Martha was busy running around doing what she thought he would have wanted her to do, trying to serve, trying to do well. Mary was spending time in his presence, being formed and informed by that encounter. That serves that representation of love God. The other parable serves love people. So we love and serve our neighbor best when we love and serve God first. So that's one of the things that Jesus is presenting as part of this collection of parables and the accompanying material. Luke is a masterful presenter of this material, and it comes together in units to kind of give a big idea, unit per unit. And this is one that we find here in one of Jesus' most beloved stories, and the material immediately before and after it.